The soft hum of machines filled the sterile air of the veterinary clinic. Whiskey lay motionless on the padded table, his black and tan fur matted with blood and dirt. Bandages wrapped tightly around his legs, immobilizing the fractures he had sustained. His breaths came slow and shallow, his chest rising and falling with a fragile rhythm that mirrored his will to survive. The early morning air was crisp as Jack Miller stood beside his Mooney M20J plane, meticulously checking every detail. The small aircraft had been his companion for years, carrying him through countless missions that had become his life's purpose, rescuing animals from overcrowded shelters and transporting them to places where they could find loving homes. At 49, Jack wasn't just a pilot, he was a lifeline for animals that the world often forgot. With each flight, he carried the weight of lives depending on him. Today was no different. As he adjusted the straps of the kettle holding Whiskey, a young, exuberant lab mix, he whispered softly, "You're going to love your new family, buddy." Beside Whiskey were two other dogs, a dignified old German shepherd with silver fur and soulful eyes, and a feisty terrier who barked at every movement Jack made. He chuckled, shaking his head. "I get it, you're the boss," he said to the terrier. The shelter staff in Maryland had been grateful, but their faces carried the exhaustion of an endless cycle, too many animals and not enough homes. Jack had promised to bring these 3 dogs to Albany, where a team of volunteers eagerly awaited them. It was a routine mission, but something felt different today. As the sun began to rise, Jack climbed into the cockpit. The dogs were securely strapped in the back, their crates positioned for maximum comfort. He glanced at the horizon, the streaks of gold and pink lighting up the sky. It was moments like these that reminded him why he did what he did. Jack's late wife, Melissa, had been his inspiration for these missions. A devoted animal lover, she had spent years working in shelters, fighting to save animals from neglect and abandonment. When she passed away 5 years ago, Jack found solace in continuing her work, transforming his grief into a mission that gave his life meaning. As he performed his pre-flight checks, a mechanic approached, wiping grease from his hands. "Everything looks good," the man said, though his tone carried a hint of hesitation. "That left engine's been temperamental. Keep an eye on it." Jack nodded, his face calm, but a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. He had dealt with mechanical quirks before, flying a small plane wasn't without its risks. Still, the thought lingered as he started the engine, the familiar hum filling the air. "Here we go," he murmured to the dogs, his voice steady but soft. Whiskey responded with a low whine, while the terrier barked twice, as if cheering him on. The German shepherd remained stoic, his eyes watching Jack intently. The plane lifted off smoothly, cutting through the morning mist like a bird finding its way home. Jack felt the familiar rush of freedom as they ascended, the ground falling away beneath them. Below, the rolling hills of Maryland stretched out, a patchwork of green and brown. For a while, everything was peaceful. Jack hummed to himself, occasionally glancing back at the dogs. Whiskey had calmed down, curling up in his crate, while the terrier and German shepherd remained alert, their eyes tracking the horizon. But as they crossed into New York airspace, the weather began to shift. Clouds thickened, and a subtle turbulence shook the plane. Jack tightened his grip on the controls, his eyes scanning the sky ahead. The faint buzz of the radio interrupted his thoughts. "This is Albany Tower. Conditions are clear for landing, but we're picking up reports of some unstable weather moving in from the west. Proceed with caution." "Copy that," Jack replied, his tone steady. He had flown through worse conditions before, but a nagging sense of unease began to creep in. He glanced at the instrument panel, his eyes lingering on the engine gauge. Everything appeared normal, for now. Back at the shelter in Albany, volunteers were preparing for the arrival of the dogs. Crates were being set up, blankets laid out, and bowls filled with fresh water. Among them was Rachel, a young woman who had worked with Jack on multiple occasions. She checked her watch, frowning. "He should have been here by now," she said to no one in particular. Maybe he hit some turbulence, another volunteer suggested, though their voice carried the same undercurrent of worry that Rachel felt. Jack was reliable, always punctual. Delays weren't in his nature. In the cockpit, Jack felt the first tremor of doubt as the turbulence grew stronger. He reached for the radio, intending to update Albany Tower, but hesitated. There was no immediate danger, and he didn't want to cause unnecessary concern. The dogs stirred in the back, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Whiskey let out a soft whimper, and Jack glanced over his shoulder. "It's okay, buddy," he said, forcing a smile. "We're almost there." The left engine sputtered briefly, a sound so faint that it could have been dismissed as normal, if not for the mechanic's earlier warning. Jack's smile faltered. He checked the gauges again, his fingers tightening on the yoke. As the clouds thickened around them, Jack's focus sharpened. Every instinct told him to stay calm, to trust his training. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this mission might not go as planned. The hum of the engine steadied as the Mooney M20J climbed higher into the morning sky, the golden light of dawn casting a warm glow over the cockpit. Jack's hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting the controls and scanning the instrument panel for any irregularities. The warning from the mechanic echoed in his mind, but he brushed it aside, focusing on the mission ahead. In the back of the plane, the dogs were settling in after the initial jolt of takeoff. Whiskey had curled into a tight ball, his black and tan coat gleaming faintly under the soft light filtering through the windows. The terrier, still high-strung, occasionally barked at the hum of the engine, while the German shepherd rested his head on his paws, his calm demeanor masking the years of hardship he had endured. Jack stole a glance at them through the rearview mirror, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Hang tight, you three," he said. "This is going to be a smooth ride." The flight from Maryland to Albany was a route Jack had flown dozens of times, and it often felt like second nature. But this time, something about the mission weighed heavily on him. He thought back to his conversation with the shelter director that morning. "They're special cases, Jack," the director had said, her voice tinged with urgency. "Whiskey's been through a lot, abused as a pup, then passed from foster to foster. He deserves a second chance." And the shepherd? He's been overlooked for years because of his age. This might be his only shot. Jack had nodded, understanding the stakes. Every mission mattered, but some carried an extra layer of responsibility. He had promised Melissa, years ago, that he would dedicate his life to making a difference for animals like these. And he had kept that promise, even when it meant late nights, long flights, and days spent away from home. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Jack allowed himself a moment of reflection. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small locket, a keepsake of Melissa's that he always carried with him. Inside was a photo of her holding a scruffy mutt, her smile radiant. "You'd love these guys," he murmured, his thumb brushing over the locket. The radio crackled, pulling him back to the present. "This is Albany Tower to Rescue 1, came the familiar voice of the air traffic controller. "Weather's holding steady on your path for now, but there's a system moving in from the west. Keep an eye out." "Rescue 1 copies," Jack replied, his tone calm. He adjusted his heading slightly, aligning the plane with the updated flight path. A glance at the fuel gauge reassured him that everything was on track. The sky remained clear for another 30 minutes, but as the plane crossed into New York airspace, the first signs of trouble began to emerge. Wisps of clouds thickened into a dense gray mass, and the wind shifted, jostling the aircraft ever so slightly. Jack tightened his grip on the yoke, his eyes scanning the horizon. Whiskey stirred in his crate, letting out a low whine. Jack glanced back, offering a reassuring smile. "It's just a few bumps, buddy," he said. "Nothing to worry about." But the subtle turbulence soon gave way to something more ominous. The plane dipped slightly, and the left engine sputtered, a brief stutter that sent a jolt of adrenaline through Jack's veins. His hands moved instinctively, adjusting the throttle and checking the gauges. Everything appeared normal, but the unease in his chest grew stronger. Back on the ground, the volunteers at the Albany shelter were busy preparing for the arrival of the dogs. Rachel, one of the team leads, had worked with Jack on several occasions and admired his dedication. She was organizing crates when a colleague approached. "Any word from Jack?" the man asked, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Not yet," Rachel replied, her voice calm but laced with anticipation. "He's usually right on time." They exchanged a glance, both silently acknowledging the unpredictability of Jack's missions. The weather had been clear earlier, but reports of incoming turbulence had already reached the shelter. Rachel forced herself to focus on the task at hand, refusing to let her mind wander to worst-case scenarios. Up in the cockpit, Jack was fully alert now. The turbulence had intensified, and the left engine sputtered again, this time louder, more persistent. He toggled the radio, his voice steady despite the tension coursing through him. "Albany Tower, this is Rescue 1. Experiencing light turbulence, but proceeding as planned." "Over." The response crackled through the speakers. "Rescue 1, proceed with caution. Conditions are expected to deteriorate within the hour. Keep us updated." "Will do," Jack replied. He exhaled slowly, focusing on keeping the plane stable. In the back, the terrier barked sharply, the sound cutting through the hum of the engine. Jack's heart ached for the animals, how much they had endured, only to face this uncertainty. He had always prided himself on being the steady hand that guided them to safety, but today, that steadiness felt fragile. "Just a little further," he whispered, more to himself than to the dogs. "We're almost there." As the minutes ticked by, the turbulence worsened. The plane rocked gently at first, then more aggressively as crosswinds battered the wings. Jack's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had flown through rough weather before, but the warning signs were piling up: the erratic engine, the shifting winds, the ominous mass of clouds ahead. The dogs were restless now, their crates rattling with each jolt. Jack spoke to them softly, his voice a calming presence in the chaos. "Stay with me, guys," he said. "We'll get through this." He reached for the throttle, adjusting it slightly, but the left engine sputtered again, louder this time. Jack's chest tightened. He glanced at the fuel gauge, the altimeter, the weather radar, each reading offering a sliver of reassurance, but none enough to ease the growing tension. As the plane approached the Catskill Mountains, Jack knew the most challenging part of the journey lay ahead. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. He couldn't afford to falter, not now, not with so much at stake. The wind howled outside the cockpit as the Mooney M20J dipped suddenly, the turbulence stronger than anything Jack had faced that day. His knuckles whitened around the yoke, his jaw set in determined concentration. The storm had closed in faster than he'd expected, clouds surrounding the plane in a swirling, gray chaos. "Stay calm," Jack muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. The dogs in the back sensed the tension. Whiskey whined softly, his paws scratching at the edge of his crate. The terrier barked, the sound sharp and panicked, while the German shepherd remained eerily silent, his eyes fixed on Jack as if understanding the gravity of the situation. The left engine sputtered again, this time more violently. Jack's stomach dropped as the aircraft jerked to the side, the controls resisting his grip. He adjusted the throttle, his eyes darting between the gauges. The altimeter showed a steady descent, too steady. "Albany Tower, this is Rescue 1, Jack called into the radio, his voice firm but strained. "I'm experiencing engine failure." "Repeat, engine failure." "Requesting emergency landing instructions." The radio crackled. "Rescue 1, maintain current heading and reduce altitude if possible. Nearest emergency airstrip is approximately 12 nautical miles east. Can you confirm control?" Jack clenched his teeth. "Negative," he replied. "Partial control only. Left engine is failing." "Understood." Sending coordinates now. Stay on course. Jack glanced at the GPS, but the storm made visibility nearly impossible. He squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the landscape below. The Catskill Mountains loomed in the distance, their dark silhouettes barely discernible through the thick clouds. Back at the Albany shelter, Rachel paced nervously. Jack was officially late, and the weather reports on the news only heightened her concern. She dialed his number again, but it went straight to voicemail. "Come on, Jack," she whispered, gripping her phone tightly. The other volunteers exchanged worried glances. They had seen delays before, but something about tonight felt different. Rachel's mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay positive. Jack was experienced. If anyone could handle this, it was him. In the cockpit, Jack's calm exterior began to crack as the left engine sputtered one last time before failing completely. The plane lurched violently, the nose dipping forward. The dogs yelped, their cries piercing through the chaos. "Hang on!" Jack shouted, though he knew they couldn't understand him. His hands moved with desperate precision, pulling the yoke back and adjusting the flaps in a last-ditch effort to steady the descent. The plane responded sluggishly, fighting his every move. The ground was coming up fast. Trees stretched out like jagged teeth below, their dark forms blending into the shadows of the mountains. Jack scanned the terrain, searching for any sign of an open field or a flat surface. There was nothing. The terrier barked again, a frantic, high-pitched sound that echoed Jack's racing heartbeat. Whiskey let out another whine, his eyes wide with fear. Jack's chest tightened. "It's okay, guys," he said, his voice breaking. "We're gonna be okay." But even as he spoke the words, he knew the odds were against them. The impact was brutal. The plane clipped the tops of several trees before slamming into the forest floor, the sound of tearing metal and splintering wood reverberating through the mountains. The cabin was thrown into chaos, the crates tumbling as the aircraft skidded to a halt against a cluster of rocks. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the faint whimpers of Whiskey, followed by the groaning creak of the damaged fuselage. Smoke rose from the wreckage, curling into the stormy sky like a ghostly signal. Jack lay slumped over the controls, unmoving. His body bore the full brunt of the crash, his final thoughts consumed by the dogs he had sworn to protect. In the back, Whiskey's broken legs kept him trapped in his crate, but his spirit remained unbroken. He whined softly, his eyes darting toward the front of the plane. The terrier had been thrown from his crate but lay still, his small body motionless. The German shepherd, battered but alive, limped toward Whiskey, nudging the crate as if to reassure him. Hours later, the faint beams of searchlights cut through the darkness. The rescue team, braving the treacherous terrain, followed the signal from the plane's emergency locator transmitter. The lead rescuer, a man named Tom, froze as the wreckage came into view. "Over here," he called to his team, his voice laced with urgency. The scene was grim. The nose of the plane was crumpled against the rocks, the wings twisted and broken. Smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of fuel and scorched earth. But amidst the devastation, there was movement. Tom approached cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the debris. The beam landed on Whiskey, who let out a weak bark, his eyes pleading. Tom's heart clenched. "We've got survivors," he shouted. The team worked quickly, carefully extracting the dogs from the wreckage. Whiskey whimpered as they lifted him, his broken legs requiring immediate attention. The German shepherd followed, limping but still alert. The terrier, tragically, did not survive. One of the rescuers knelt beside Jack, shaking his head. "He didn't make it," he said quietly. Tom nodded, his expression somber. "But he saved them," he replied, glancing at the dogs being loaded onto stretchers. "That has to mean something." As the rescue team made their way back through the forest, carrying the surviving dogs, the storm began to subside. The clouds parted just enough to reveal a patch of starlit sky, a quiet reminder of the sacrifices made that night. Whiskey let out another soft bark, as if sensing that the worst was behind him. And in that moment, the weight of Jack's loss was tempered by the knowledge that his mission had not been in vain. The faint light of dawn crept over the Catskill Mountains as the rescue team emerged from the dense forest, their faces etched with exhaustion and resolve. They carried stretchers bearing the surviving dogs, the delicate task of extracting them from the wreckage now complete. Whiskey lay on one stretcher, his black and tan fur matted with blood and dirt, his legs immobilized by makeshift splints. Beside him, the German Shepherd limped on his own, refusing to leave Whiskey's side. Tom, the lead rescuer, watched the dogs closely as the team reached their vehicles. "Load them carefully," he instructed, his voice firm but gentle. "The vet clinic's expecting us." The German Shepherd hesitated as rescuers guided Whiskey's stretcher into the van, his golden eyes filled with an almost human concern. "It's okay," Tom murmured, crouching beside him. "He's in good hands." As the shepherd climbed into the van, Tom's gaze shifted to the treetops, where the smoke from the crash still lingered. His thoughts turned to Jack Miller, the pilot whose body they had carefully covered at the scene. "You gave everything," Tom whispered, the weight of the moment settling over him. Back at the Albany shelter, Rachel paced anxiously near the clinic entrance. She had barely slept since news of the crash had reached her late the previous night. Every update from the rescue team felt like a lifeline, and a reminder of the risks Jack had taken. When the van finally pulled up, Rachel ran to meet it. Her heart sank as she saw the condition of the dogs. Whiskey's stretcher was carefully unloaded first, his broken legs and visible injuries stark reminders of the ordeal he had endured. The German Shepherd followed, limping slightly but alert, his eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for someone familiar. "They survived," Tom said simply, his voice a mix of relief and sorrow. "But Jack didn't." Rachel's breath caught, and she pressed a hand to her chest. She had known Jack for years, his steady demeanor, his unwavering commitment to the animals he rescued. The thought of him being gone felt like losing a cornerstone of their community. She forced herself to focus on the task at hand. "Let's get them inside," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They need help." Inside the veterinary clinic, the team worked with precision. Whiskey was sedated and prepped for surgery to repair his fractured legs, while the German Shepherd was examined for minor injuries. Rachel stayed close, refusing to leave until she was certain both dogs were stable. As she waited, her mind wandered to the countless flights Jack had completed over the years. She remembered the first time he had arrived at the Albany shelter, stepping out of his plane with a golden retriever who had been abandoned during a storm. Jack had smiled, a little shyly, and said, "Figured I'd bring her to someone who could give her a real shot." That memory brought a bittersweet smile to Rachel's face. Jack had always been more than a pilot, he was a protector, a savior. And now, even in death, he had ensured that two lives would have a chance to go on. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the clinic staff delivered updates. Whiskey's surgery had gone well, though his recovery would take time and patience. The German Shepherd, resilient as ever, needed only rest and monitoring. Both dogs were expected to survive. Rachel stepped into the recovery room, her heart heavy but hopeful. Whiskey lay on a padded bed, his legs wrapped in clean bandages. He stirred slightly as she approached, letting out a soft whimper. Rachel knelt beside him, gently stroking his head. "You're safe now," she whispered. Jack made sure of that. The German Shepherd sat nearby, watching Whiskey intently. He let out a low, protective growl as Rachel adjusted Whiskey's blanket, and she chuckled softly. "It's okay, big guy," she said. "He's in good hands." Tom entered the room quietly, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He placed it on a nearby table and turned to Rachel. "This was in the wreckage," he said. "Figured you'd want to keep it." Rachel unfolded the cloth, revealing Jack's flight logbook, slightly singed but intact. Her fingers traced the familiar scrawl of his handwriting. Each page told the story of a life dedicated to saving others. She swallowed hard, her vision blurring. "He was one of a kind," she said softly. "Yeah," Tom replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "He was." Outside the clinic, the media had started to gather, word of the crash spreading quickly. Reporters asked about the pilot, the dogs, and the cause of the accident. Rachel, still reeling from the events, gave a brief statement. "Jack Miller was a hero," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "He dedicated his life to giving animals a second chance. And even in the end, he made sure these two survived. That's who he was." As night fell, Rachel returned to the shelter, her thoughts consumed by the events of the day. The staff had created a small memorial for Jack in the front lobby, with candles, flowers, and photos of the animals he had rescued over the years. Rachel placed his logbook among the tributes, a silent promise that his work would not be forgotten. Whiskey and the German Shepherd, though injured and shaken, represented hope, a testament to Jack's unwavering mission. As Rachel looked at their photos pinned to the memorial wall, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. "We'll take it from here, Jack," she whispered. "You've done more than enough." The days following the crash were a whirlwind of activity, sorrow, and reflection. At the Albany shelter, the staff worked tirelessly to ensure Whiskey and the German Shepherd received the care they needed. The clinic had become a hub of quiet determination, where every step of recovery felt like a tribute to Jack Miller's sacrifice. Whiskey had emerged from surgery with a determined spirit. Though his legs were wrapped in thick bandages, his eyes showed the resilience of a survivor. Rachel often visited him during her breaks, sitting quietly beside his bed and stroking his head as he rested. "You're tougher than you look," she murmured one afternoon, watching as Whiskey stirred and wagged his tail weakly in response. The connection between them deepened with each visit, and Rachel found herself marveling at the dog's will to heal. The German Shepherd, whom the staff began calling Shadow, was never far from Whiskey. Though his injuries were minor, Shadow had taken on the role of protector, often lying beside Whiskey and growling softly if anyone approached too quickly. The bond between the two dogs became a symbol of the survival and unity that defined their journey. Meanwhile, the shelter community rallied to honor Jack's memory. A vigil was planned for the weekend, drawing in volunteers, rescuers, and supporters from all over the region. Word of the crash had spread beyond Albany, and people who had never met Jack were touched by his story. Rachel took charge of organizing the event, pouring herself into the preparations. She reached out to former adopters who had received animals transported by Jack, inviting them to share their stories. The response was overwhelming. Families sent photos, letters, and even videos of their pets, each one a testament to the countless lives Jack had changed. One letter stood out. It came from a couple who had adopted a pit bull named Daisy, one of Jack's earliest rescues. The letter read, "Jack didn't just bring Daisy to us, he brought us joy, laughter, and a reminder that love can heal even the deepest wounds. We'll never forget what he did for our family." Rachel wiped her eyes as she read it, the enormity of Jack's impact sinking in. She placed the letter among the growing collection of tributes, determined to make the vigil a fitting celebration of his life. On the day of the vigil, the shelter transformed into a sanctuary of remembrance. Candles lined the walkway, their flames flickering gently in the evening breeze. A photo of Jack stood at the center of the memorial, surrounded by flowers, handwritten notes, and pictures of animals he had saved. Whiskey and Shadow were present, their recovery beds placed near the front of the gathering. Whiskey's bandages had been freshly changed, and though he remained immobile, his alert gaze followed the movements of those around him. Shadow lay beside him, his calm presence a source of comfort. Rachel stepped forward to address the crowd, her hands trembling slightly as she held Jack's logbook. She took a deep breath, drawing strength from the faces around her. "Jack Miller wasn't just a pilot," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. He was a hero, a friend, and a beacon of hope for so many animals and people. He dedicated his life to giving others a second chance, and even in the end, he stayed true to that mission. She opened the logbook, flipping to a page near the middle. This was one of his entries, she said, her voice softening. Sometimes, the journey is rough, but the destination makes it all worthwhile. If even one life is saved, then every mile was worth it. The crowd listened in silence, many wiping tears from their eyes. Rachel continued, sharing stories of Jack's kindness, his unwavering commitment, and the countless lives he had touched. As she spoke, the candles seemed to burn brighter, their glow a reminder of the light Jack had brought into the world. Later that evening, as the crowd began to disperse, Rachel lingered near the memorial. She watched as families approached Whiskey and Shadow, offering gentle pets and words of encouragement. The sight filled her heart with a bittersweet ache. Jack's absence was palpable, but his legacy was alive in every act of kindness and every life saved. Tom joined her, his hands in his pockets as he gazed at the scene. "He'd be proud," he said quietly. Rachel nodded, her eyes fixed on Whiskey's bandaged legs. "He would. But I can't help wishing he were here to see it." Tom placed a hand on her shoulder. "In a way, he is. Look at them." He gestured toward Whiskey and Shadow, who were now surrounded by smiling children. "They're alive because of him. That's his legacy." As the night deepened, Rachel returned to the clinic to check on Whiskey and Shadow. The room was quiet, the hum of machines a soft backdrop. Whiskey dozed lightly, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Shadow lay beside him, his body curled protectively around his companion. Rachel sat beside them, her heart full of both sorrow and gratitude. She pulled Jack's logbook from her bag, flipping through the pages until she found a blank one near the back. With a pen in hand, she began to write. "Jack, you always said that saving one life could change the world. You've saved so many lives, and now it's our turn to carry on your mission. Thank you for everything. We'll never forget you." She closed the book, placing it gently beside Whiskey's bed. As she sat there, the faintest wag of Whiskey's tail brought a small smile to her lips. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "And so are we." The Albany shelter buzzed with renewed energy in the weeks following the vigil. Jack Miller's story had reached far beyond their small community, inspiring people across the region to get involved in animal rescue. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up in droves, and the shelter was inundated with offers to foster and adopt. Whiskey and Shadow had become local celebrities, their journey of survival a symbol of resilience and hope. Shadow, the stoic German shepherd, had recovered quickly, his strength and calm demeanor earning him admiration from the staff and visitors alike. Whiskey, however, faced a longer road. His broken legs required intensive physical therapy, and though he was making steady progress, each step was a challenge. Rachel had taken a personal interest in Whiskey's recovery. She often spent her evenings at the clinic, helping him through his exercises. With each session, she could see his determination grow, his wagging tail a testament to his unbreakable spirit. "Come on, buddy," she encouraged one evening, crouching beside him as he struggled to take a step. "You've got this." Whiskey paused, his legs trembling, but then, with a soft whine, he took another step forward. Rachel clapped her hands, tears springing to her eyes. "That's it. You're amazing." Shadow watched from nearby, his golden eyes filled with quiet pride. Though he didn't need physical therapy, he rarely left Whiskey's side, his presence a constant source of comfort. Meanwhile, Tom had taken it upon himself to organize a broader tribute to Jack. Inspired by the stories shared at the vigil, he began reaching out to people Jack had impacted. The response was overwhelming. Families sent photos of pets Jack had transported, along with heartfelt messages about how those animals had changed their lives. One letter stood out to Tom. It came from a boy named Ethan, who had adopted a shy beagle named Max a year earlier. Max was scared of everything when we got him, Ethan wrote. But Jack told us that all he needed was love and patience. Now Max sleeps on my bed every night. Jack was right, he just needed a chance. Tom decided to compile the letters and photos into a book titled Wings of Hope, The Legacy of Jack Miller. The project became a labor of love, with contributions flooding in from all over the country. As the book took shape, Tom felt a growing sense of purpose. Jack's life may have ended, but his mission would carry on. The shelter's efforts culminated in a special adoption event, dedicated to Jack's memory. Rachel and the team worked tirelessly to prepare, transforming the shelter into a festive space with balloons, banners, and adoption booths. The event was called Second Chances, a phrase Jack often used to describe his work. Whiskey and Shadow were the stars of the day. Shadow, fully recovered, walked confidently through the crowd, accepting gentle pets and admiration from visitors. Whiskey, still on the mend but visibly stronger, wagged his tail from his recovery bed, his eyes bright with curiosity. Tom unveiled the completed Wings of Hope book during the event, presenting the first copy to Rachel. She held it carefully, her fingers tracing the cover, which featured a photo of Jack beside a small plane, a golden retriever sitting at his feet. "He'd be so proud of this," Rachel said softly. Tom nodded. "It's not just about remembering him. It's about continuing what he started." As the day went on, families filled the shelter, meeting animals and hearing their stories. By the end of the event, dozens of pets had found new homes, each adoption a testament to Jack's enduring impact. Among the adopters was a man named Dan, one of the rescuers who had been part of the team that found Whiskey and Shadow. He had been deeply moved by their bond and decided to adopt Shadow, vowing to give him the life Jack would have wanted. "I'll take care of him," Dan said as he signed the adoption papers. "He deserves the best." Shadow seemed to understand, pressing his head against Dan's hand as if to say thank you. As for Whiskey, his journey was far from over. Though his recovery would take months, Rachel had already made up her mind. One evening, as she sat beside him at the clinic, she reached out and gently stroked his head. "You're coming home with me," she said softly. "You'll have a family, and a chance to heal." Whiskey's tail wagged in response, a slow, deliberate motion that felt like an affirmation. In the weeks that followed, the shelter saw a surge in adoptions and community support. Rachel brought Whiskey home, where he quickly became part of her family. He still limped occasionally, but his progress was remarkable. Shadow thrived in his new home with Dan, often accompanying him on hikes through the very mountains where Jack had saved his life. Tom's Wings of Hope book became a bestseller within the animal rescue community, with proceeds going to fund new transport missions. The shelter used the funds to purchase a new van, christened Miller's Mission, ensuring that Jack's work would continue to save lives. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the crash, the community gathered once more to honor Jack. The shelter had erected a small memorial in his name, featuring a plaque that read, "In memory of Jack Miller, whose wings carried hope to those who needed it most. Your legacy lives on in every life you touched." Rachel stood beside the memorial, Whiskey at her side. As the crowd dispersed, she knelt down and whispered, "We're doing it, Jack. We're keeping your promise." Above them, the sky was clear, the stars shining brightly, a quiet reminder that Jack's mission had not ended but transformed into something greater. The morning was bright and crisp as Rachel stepped outside her home, Whiskey trotting beside her with newfound energy. His legs, though not as strong as they once were, carried him with determination. It had been nearly a year since the crash, and every step he took felt like a victory, not just for him, but for the legacy he represented. "Ready for your big day?" Rachel asked, crouching to scratch behind Whiskey's ears. His tail wagged furiously in response, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Today, Whiskey was joining Rachel at a local rescue event inspired by Jack Miller's work. The initiative, called Paws Across Borders, aimed to connect shelters across state lines, ensuring that every animal had a chance to find a home. Whiskey, now a symbol of resilience, had become the event's honorary ambassador. At the event, the shelter buzzed with activity. Families wandered between the rows of crates, meeting animals and hearing their stories. Volunteers worked tirelessly, sharing adoption success stories and guiding visitors through the process. A large banner hung above the entrance, its bold letters reading, "In honor of Jack Miller, saving lives, one flight at a time." Rachel and Whiskey arrived to a flurry of greetings. Children ran up to pet Whiskey, their laughter echoing across the lot. Though his limp was still noticeable, it didn't slow him down. He moved from one group to the next, soaking in the attention and affection. "He's a miracle," one visitor remarked to Rachel. "You'd never guess what he's been through." Rachel smiled, glancing down at Whiskey. "He's tougher than he looks," she said. "And he's proof that second chances are worth fighting for." Nearby, Shadow and Dan were also present, offering a quieter but no less impactful presence. Shadow's calm demeanor made him a favorite among visitors, and Dan often found himself sharing the story of the crash and the dog's survival. "I didn't just adopt him," Dan told one family. "He adopted me, too. He's taught me more about resilience than I ever thought possible." The family listened intently, their children stroking Shadow's thick fur. By the time they moved on, they had already chosen a dog to adopt, a young collie mix that reminded them of Shadow's strength and loyalty. As the event continued, Rachel noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Tom had arrived, carrying a fresh box of Wings of Hope books. He approached Rachel, nodding toward Whiskey. "Looks like someone's enjoying his spotlight," Tom said with a grin. "He's earned it," Rachel replied. "And it's all because of Jack." Tom's expression softened. "Speaking of Jack," he said, handing Rachel one of the books. "This copy's for you. It's the final edition." Rachel flipped through the pages, her heart swelling as she recognized the photos and letters from families Jack had helped. The book was a tangible reminder of his impact, a legacy that would continue to inspire. Toward the end of the day, Rachel gathered the crowd for a special announcement. She stood near the main stage, with Whiskey and Shadow by her side. The crowd quieted as she stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "This event isn't just about finding homes for these animals, it's about continuing a mission that started with one man's dream." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. Jack Miller believed that every life matters. He dedicated himself to ensuring that animals, no matter how forgotten or broken, were given a second chance. And today, because of him, we're able to save even more lives. The crowd erupted into applause, the energy electric. Rachel continued, her voice growing stronger. "Whiskey and Shadow are living proof of Jack's legacy. They survived because of his courage and determination. And now, they're here to remind us that even in the face of tragedy, hope prevails." As the applause faded, Rachel smiled, looking down at Whiskey. "So let's honor Jack the best way we can, by giving these animals the homes they deserve." By the end of the event, dozens of animals had been adopted, and the shelter had secured enough donations to fund several more rescue missions. Whiskey and Shadow remained the heart of the day, their stories touching everyone who met them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel sat on the grass with Whiskey beside her, watching as the last families drove away with their new companions. Shadow and Dan joined them, the German shepherd lying contentedly at Rachel's feet. "You did good today, buddy," Rachel said, scratching Whiskey's head. He let out a soft bark, his tail thumping against the ground. Dan nodded. "Jack would be proud." Rachel smiled, her gaze drifting toward the sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, their light soft but unwavering. "Yeah," she said softly. "He would." A year after the crash, Jack's legacy had grown into a movement. Shelters across the country had adopted his model of collaboration, and more lives were being saved every day. Whiskey and Shadow continued to inspire everyone they met, their bond a reminder of the strength found in survival. And though Jack was gone, his mission lived on, in every paw that stepped into a new home, in every wagging tail, and in every heart touched by his unwavering dedication.